Right, good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here this Maundy Thursday before Easter for a lecture by Professor Stephen Martin. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Alison Otter and I'm the director of the Society. Professor Martin is, of course, a fellow of the RAS and is also honorary professor of psychiatry at the University of Chiang Mai, and is presently in Thailand, where it must be about nigh on midnight or so. He did tell me earlier that he'd had 2 siestas this afternoon, so he's in fine fettle. He's going to lecture to us tonight on the topic, was the VOC funding Mozart? And of course, this is the basis of an article which was published in the JRAS in 2023. So this is where it originated from. So I'm just going to hand over to Professor Martin, and off we go. Thank you very much. And perhaps you'd like to welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Alison. Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to have the chance to speak to you. I'm going to go through, in particular, the evidence from the diaries of a Dutch East India Company merchant for how the money was generated for paying for most of Mozart's flute works. And it's quite right, I am in Thailand. I'm in this building, which is an education centre and an exhibition room that we built to try and help underprivileged children, and brought across some inexpensive artworks. And we get the local schools in and let them handle things like Stone Age flints and look at old maps and pictures, and it's quite good fun. And about 7 years ago, I was collecting paintings that had failed to sell at auction, and came across this, and it had been up for sale several times and not sold. And I had a very good idea that it was Dr. Ferdinand de Jong who'd sponsored the Mozart flute concertos, because in this painting by Jacobus Buyse, there is a globe showing Asia, and he's got a Baroque flute. So we managed to get it very inexpensively for 3 figures, I think, and studied it carefully, including high-resolution photography and magnification. And we did a presentation on this, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago now, at the Society, including doing some performance of the Mozart. And the painting itself is remarkable, because when de Jong, having been a town surgeon in Batavia, got back to the Dutch Republic, having survived 10 years in the Far East, he sponsored a number of artists and sponsored Mozart. And one of the works that he sponsored, of course, was the painting itself. And it's unusual because in the middle, he shows his life story with emblems of Freemasonry, an anatomy book, map of Asia, and an actual Mozart flute concerto on his table, with the letters MO in sepia on the back of the manuscript. And above his head are sheep to the right and goats to the left, which is an emblem of judgment. And likewise, below his life story, there are bare legs of his own anatomy in the furniture, and then the legs of the table covered, which is Isaiah 47. It's another emblem of judgment. And it's by this artist, Jacobus Buyse, who lived round the corner from de Jong in Amsterdam and in Leiden. And there's the map of Batavia. You can just as say make out the MO letters on the manuscript. The bottom right notes are FD for Ferdinand de Jong. And in his hat, there are Freemason symbols of a heart's dividers, a perfect circle, and the triangle of the hat facing you. We also think that these paintings are connected to de Jong too, because we know de Jong's maidservant came back from Java and was not only adopted by de Jong and his wife, but was baptized and given a freedom, and not many Javanese slaves going into freedom would have fitted that bill, but this girl does to perfection. And there's a Freemasons obelisk fountain in the background. More of that later. It was rare that the money coming through the Dutch East India Company went to good use, but there was another example. This is Jan Moyer's 6-story observatory, which he built in Batavia, now completely gone. And Ferdinand de Jong met Mozart in Mannheim in 1777. Mozart had gone there seeking work from the Elector, Karl Theodor, that's his palace that still stands. And de Jong was introduced to Mozart by his friend through the Freemasons, Johann Baptist Wendling, who was the world's greatest flautist at the time. And he wanted to commission a number of flute quartets and 2 concertos. Now, Mozart in Mannheim had the chance to go into this church, which is the Jesuiten church. And it has a beautiful statue personifying Asia in the chancel. And in Mozart's time, these frescoes were visible. They're no longer on display. I think they've been painted over. But in the center, you can see St. Francis Xaver shipwrecked in India. And interestingly, Mozart christened his son Franz Xaver. Karl Theodor had a porcelain factory, and these are some of the personifications of Asia from vases and table centerpieces. So there was this romantic ideal of Asia. He also incorporated it into his music in Mithridates, King of Pontus, and in the Escape from the Seraglio. So 2 operas had Asian themes. It was there. And when Mozart went to Schwetzingen, Karl Theodor was building his mosque. He was a very interesting character. At the time, Joseph Haydn's boss, Nicholas Esterhazy, and the boss of C.P.E. Bach, who was Frederick the Great, they were at war. They were killing each other. But not so Karl Theodor. He avoided politics like the plague, and he never got involved in any conflict. He simply created wealth from his massive estates with the wine trade and porcelain manufacturing, and he spent his money not on warfare, but on orchestras, wine, and sex. And when the Saxon ambassador was there, he said the court was full of little electors and electresses from all of his mistresses. And this is the mosque in the grounds of Schwetzingen, which was built by Karl Theodor, not as a practicing mosque, but an emblem of religious tolerance under Freemasonry principles. An extraordinarily beautiful place. And the concertos were probably performed here. That's Wendling at the bottom with his pince-nez glasses, and the theatre at Schwetzingen. It is uncertain exactly how many work Mozart completed for Ferdinand de Jong, but we know that he paid 2,000 guilders, 200 guilders, about £200, £2,000 rough modern equivalent, possibly more. And he completed probably 3, if not 4 flute quartets eventually. He transposed the oboe concerto into D major and wrote an original G major flute concerto for de Jong, as well as a most beautiful Andante in C. The manuscript at the bottom is from one of the flute concertos, where Mozart has written a spoof title of Rondier a U and Allegro grazioso ma non troppo presto, and he goes on for another 4 lines describing just the speed as a joke. There's the MO letters on the back of the manuscript in the center. Now, the thrust of the paper, which came out 2 years ago, and the talk tonight is about exactly where the money came from, because one question at the end of the talk was what was traded in the Gulf that actually generated de Jong's money. He inherited his fortune from his wife due to progressive inheritance laws in the Dutch Republic and in the VOC. And after she died, he appears to have done an increasing amount of artistic sponsorship in painting and in music. Now, we know, particularly from the work of two of my colleagues, Professor Otto Blaker and Falk Steins, that Buschman was the under merchant and then the upper merchant on Kharg Island in the Persian Gulf. And looking further into that, he was born in Elburg, which is an old hands town in northeast Netherlands. And interestingly, his father was a pastor, and it had a thriving integrated Jewish community all along. So there was an element of religious tolerance. Buschman and his father both published works. When Buschman was 19, having done a law degree, he wrote about civil law in the Dutch Republic and published this treatise. And at the same time, his father was writing an analysis, several hundred pages of Jacob and Moses in the Old Testament. And one thing we noticed when we read Buschman's diaries was that he was paying his slaves, his black slaves on Kharg Island, and allowing them to continue practicing West African rights. There was an element of tolerance. Buschman's academic legal writing was well referenced in Latin. Now, these are the centers of the Persian Gulf in the 18th century. Kharg Island is at the top near Basra and not far from Kuwait. It's pretty much a desert terrain, although from ancient history it had been irrigated, and at the northeast corner was the Dutch fort and where the town is still today. You can see the airstrip, and it's also Iran's main oil terminal. It had an Achaemenid inscription about irrigating the land from a well. Unfortunately, 15 years ago, someone took a hammer and chisel to it. And also in Buschman's time, he would have seen the remains of the Sassanid church and from which this cross came. It's the only such church in Bushehr province, historically quite important. We will be talking about the character of Mir Muhammad later in the talk. There is another Mir Muhammad, not to be confused with him, from several centuries earlier, and this is his shrine on Kharg. He was Imam Zadir Mir Muhammad Hanifi, and his tomb was built in 1338 with these very beautiful Persian medieval tiles inside, and also Parthian tombs from about 2,000 years ago, bringing us back to Mithridates and the Mozart opera. And Kharg has a fountain displaying pearl oyster, which into the 20th century was very important for its economy. That's the site of the town just beyond the airstrip. And above it, you can see Khargu Island. Thomson in 1891 did a series of photographs of Kharg and the islanders, which are in Leiden University libraries. And here are some of the pearl fishes in the 19th century. He took a couple of images of Buschman's fort, including the gun platform at the top and the composite arch of the Arab lancet and the archway. So that was the VOC fort, the Dutch East India Company fort on Kharg Island. And to the east of the fort, to the left of the picture, is what appears to be Buschman's actual headquarters and his residence with the colonnade. There's a map of it, bottom left on the map, the fort and the VOC buildings and the town and the ramparts around it. And this map was from Carsten Niebuhr's history of 1776. There's another picture of the Dutch ramparts and Buschman's apparent residence. And there was still a pearl fleet operating in 1891. There's some of the boats. And it went on in the Gulf until the 1970s. He is one of the very last pearl boats. And the reason for the demise was globalization, cultured pearls, freshwater pearls, and it basically fizzled out. When I was an honorary senior research fellow at Durham, I had an office over the corridor from a very smartly dressed PhD student. And it's this chap, Dr. Sultan bin Muhammad Al-Qasimi. And we had a lot of interesting conversations about the pearl trade and his thesis. At the time, I was researching functional brain scanning, and I had no idea I was going to be quoting from his thesis so extensively in future. But he really is a very nice chap. And in Sharjah, he set up a pearl fishing museum with original pearl boats and the anchors, the baskets for bringing up the oysters, and the weights at the bottom so that the divers could get down to the bed. And these are the sorters for the larger, medium, and the small pearls. We know from the VOC records and East India Company records in Bombay that Buschman married Anna Maria Pak in 1755, and he was in Bombay for his preliminary VOC duties. He was under merchant from January 1757 on Kharg under Baron Tito Friedrich von Kniphausen. Now, the first clue that Kniphausen was a psychopath was that he wasn't a baron and that he'd adopted the title. In the same year, he tried to get 6 glass diving bells, saying that he wanted to get better access to the pearl beds. And he let slip that they were in rather large quantities, but there's no mention of pearls in the records from 1761 to 63, nor in any cargo manifests. In 1762, Mir Mahana, who was one of the coastal noble families, attacked Kharg and was foiled, and though he clearly had his eye on the pearl business. Edward Ives was an interesting character in the 1760s. He was in the Royal Navy and appears to have jumped off of a ship, apparently wanting to go and explore Arabia at his own expense, and it was very questionable he had any funds for it. It appears he may very well have been spying and doing an espionage mission, and actually funded by the Navy, even though he professed he'd given up. And he went to Kharg, and it's very evident from his description that Kniphausen had greatly exaggerated the pearl bed depths, as if he was trying to put people off the scent of how easy it was to get the wealth of the pearls out. He talked of poor success, and Kniphausen also said he needed these new inventions, Edmund Halley's diving bells, in order to get at it, which was nonsense, because you could look at how deep it was now. And he actively dispelled evidence of his wealth and opened oysters in private. His secret pearl activity was only really documented coincidentally by Ives and other foreign observers who were gathering intelligence. Ives talks about meeting the Bushmans and smoking the Callian with them and having pleasant times in their gardens. And this is actually from Ives' book on the page where he describes meeting the Bushmans, Persian-style Callian. That's a Callian base on the right, and the hookah is different. It's more of a bell shape, as shown on the left, the Indian hookah. Now, Kniphausen said to Ives that pearl oysters have been found near this island, but as they lie in considerable depths, not less than 13 or 14 fathom water, which is nonsense, the divers, who were not very expert, had not met with much success at the time we were there. And none of that is true, because they'd been doing it for 2,000 years and it was nowhere near that deep. So he described fishing out one big pearl witnessed by Ives, but that was it. We know from documents going back 1 and even 2,000 years that pearls were very rich. The Hudud al-Alam describes Kharg, south of Basra, 50 farsakhs away, which is dead right as an Arabian distance measure. It possesses a large and prosperous town called Kharg. Near it, excellent and costly pearls are found. And after Bushman's time, a British 19th century report said Kharg had the best pearl beds in the whole of the Gulf, and they were at all depths from just below the waterline. And in 1907, Kharg had 40 pearl boats. The periplus of the Erythraean Sea The mid-1st century described the mouth of the Persian Gulf having much diving for the pearls. It mentions Charax, Spacini, which may relate to the etymology of Kharg Island as Kharg. And that is a copy from the 800s in the Heidelberg Library. It also mentions the regions beyond these places, in other words, the Indian Ocean and beyond, are either difficult of access because of their excessive winters and great cold, or else cannot be sought out because of some divine influence of the gods. We know that's wrong, because Mortimer Wheeler excavated a huge Roman port full of Roman finds at Pondicherry. Here's a pearl from the Emirates. This was used as jewellery in 6000 BC on a Mesolithic site at Marawa. I showed you earlier the weights that the divers used to go off the boats to the seabed, and there's one in use. And the seabed is shallow because it was the Garden of Eden. It only flooded when the ice caps melted about 10,000 years ago, and the Gulf is therefore not very deep. And you can see the reefs on these aerial photographs. That's Cargo Island, and then on the left is the reefs to the north of Kharg. The British Admiralty charts show that the maximum depth is 24 feet, and those great spikes, they're mostly the reefs. So it's obvious that Kniphausen was lying. Armed with 2 secret weapons, I asked the National Archives of the Netherlands to digitalise all 300 pages of Buschman's records, which were transcribed in the Batavia volumes and ended up in the Netherlands rather than destroyed in Indonesia. The first secret weapon was Holtrop's Dutch-English Dictionary of 1824, and the vocabulary in that was perfect because the VOC grade terms and technical terms were all in it by then. My second secret weapon was this chap, Geordie Geelings, who was writing his PhD on the Masonic lodges of the Roman Catholics in the Dutch Republic, and he checked everything for me, which was very kind of him. Buschman was an upper merchant according to the VOC records from 1763 to 1764. And in that year, looking at his tallies, his accounts, he described it as a poor year, and the sugar profits were only just over 100,000 florins or guilders. And he could not have raked off minimal sugar income to justify the amount of money we demonstrated he had when he left Kharg. Ship levies would have been paltry, and in that year's records, in their entirety, there was no mention of pearls. The image, by the way, is George III and Queen Charlotte with few teeth left, giving up sugar as part of the anti-slavery protest. Buschman recorded the foreign trading ships, which is quite helpful. From September 63 to August 1764, there were 24 foreign ships went into Kharg. 15 were British. 7 of them, about half, he did the basic cargo lists, including sugar, tin, iron, and steel. The sugar came from Bengal or Cochin, and they were going between Colombo, Bombay, and Surat to Basra or Bandar Bashir. Most of the records are pretty dull. There are about 20 pages of actual accounts, but there's a very interesting letter that Buschman wrote in really good French, and this was addressed to the British agent in Basra. It was a letter of complaint because one British crew had obviously let the side down in August 1764, and Buschman was furious because a British ship's party had chased the Persians around the VOC lodge, hit the doors and windows with axes, and set fire to the gun platforms, as illustrated. He would have had more trade through his hands in 1763, but a VOC ship, the Amstelveen, ran aground in fog and heavy seas, where it's marked on the map on the right. And this was off the coast of Oman. There were 30 survivors and a lot had perished. And they had to trek back to Muscat, staying in villages or desperately scrounging things to eat and short of water. They must have stayed at villages for quite a while on occasions, because it took them 2 years to get back to Muscat, and that was described by two of the party, by Aix and Dornbus. Buschman noted that some of that cargo, on his say-so, was handed over to Ali Pasha of Baghdad, he said, to keep the peace. And he used it to blame poor trade progress on the loss of the Amstelveen. You have a sense from Buschman that trade was genuinely difficult, but he was also worried because, as I shall demonstrate, he was up to something. On board the Amstelveen were nutmeg, cloves, sapanwood, as illustrated, for dyes, tin, which had come from Bangkar Island off Sumatra, and a large quantity of sugar was lost, mainly powder sugar and also a loaf or candy sugar. And that was about half of what was stored and could be evacuated 2 years later on Kharg. It was a large amount and a valuable cargo. Buschman reported to Batavia that the loss was offset by profitable sales from a ship arriving called the Rebecca Jacoba van Rostwoude. The British tried to exploit the supply gap from the wreck and bring in lots of goods. The VOC therefore tried to sell more sugar. The sugar price went up, and the British lost competitive sugar stock. He was anxious that the price might not hold, and he said, if that happens, don't blame me for that. They can't always stay the same. He discussed some trade in shawcloth, but there was no mention of pearls. In his last year as upper merchant, these are his accounts of profit and loss and factors. He was only able to do this after Kharg fell to the attack of Mir Muhammad in December 1765. He itemized the goods, as I'll show in a table, and also 447 shawl cloths, 570 items of bedclothes being sold at a small loss. There were only 40 florins of profits from waistbands and lapis lazuli pigment. So this was what was actually traded in his last year as upper merchant on Kharg. And his sugar profit had gone down a huge amount. The previous year, the profit was about 100,000 florins, and that year it had gone down to about 25,000 florins, which was paltry. But they made some significant profit from cloves and nutmeg, or mace, which is a strong spice from nutmeg husk used for medicine and flavouring, and also benzoin from styrax tree resin for burning incense. There was no silk or thread, and they made 1 florin profit of sandalwood. Now, it's interesting, when Carsten Niebuhr of the Danish Arabian expedition met Buschman in June 1765, he described Buschman having a reception for the envoy of Mir Mahana, because Buschman had allowed Mir Mahana to graze his animals in Cargo Island, which he had rented from Mir Mahana's father. Mir Mahana killed his father and his brother to take power of the coast. Niebuhr described Buschman's handsome entourage and the VOC soldiers at their posts and the sailors on their ships, so he laid on this massively impressive show. Buschman sat on a large armchair with his secretary and ensign, and he said, "Und alle seine Schwarzen und die übrigen Bedienten," all of his black slaves and his various servants, on both sides of the white pillared hall, which appears to have been photographed by Thomson. And what's very interesting is the envoy of Mir Mahana put his hand on Buschman's shoulder and said, "If you had to give up such a fort, you would no longer be worthy of being governor here." It was a very prophetic statement. Buschman remained pessimistic and apologetic. He wrote to Batavia, "It is to my eternal regret that the profits have been small, caused by the bad circumstances mentioned above, which no human being could have foreseen or known about. My tireless attempts and vigilance, to which my ambition and the interests were united." But you have a sense that there's a nervousness in what he's saying. He mentioned the case of a Franz Cantor. Cantor had worked in Basra, and he owed the VOC a large amount of money from a loan which he did not pay off. the VOC took out an injunction against his family to try and recoup it, and he fled to Amsterdam to escape the jurisdiction of the VOC. The laws were different. For example, slavery was legal in the Dutch East Indies, but when Anna Kanangan, the maid of De Jong, went back to Amsterdam, she had to be freed. Eventually, Kharg was attacked by Mir Mahana, which he'd obviously been planning all along. And he took up menacing positions on sea and land, according to the reports sent back to Batavia. He had a large armed fleet. They occupied the Armenians' houses outside the bastion. They had multiple cannon batteries and small guns. Buschman ran away onto the ship as fast as he possibly could. And the town was completely surrounded. There were two ships, the Valkyrie and the Kronenberg. They were completely cut off from land access. The attackers had scaling ladders, and Buschman said there was great morosity among the Europeans and the Moors of the town. His colleague Van Houting left the ramparts to negotiate surrender under white flag, and some records were left behind with the goods, which may or may not have been convenient. So they'd escaped the town, they'd gone shipboard, there were still some residents, servants, and the black militia, his technical slaves, were paid soldiers, though only on 1/10 the rate of the Dutch. They never fired a shot in anger. Poetic justice, you might say. This is what they managed to evacuate from the island in December 1765. They already had a large stock of sugar on the Kronenberg, as well as tin, sappanwood, and some construction beams. And they transported out of Kharg town onto the Valkyrie powder and candy sugar, tin, cloves, and nutmeg. In these notes here, Buschman said he had some rose water for personal use, and he asked permission of the Dutch East India Company if he could keep it. It wasn't worth much. The sappanwood was for red dye, as we've said. Now, after Mir Mahana fled, as there had been no mention of pearls for years, and certainly none at all in Buschman's time as upper merchant, all of a sudden, in the Basra Diaries and the British archives, an Armenian JRAS official wrote that Mir Mahana had, within a few months, left behind many pearls. Mir Mahana had to flee because he'd really annoyed Karim Khan Zand, who was ruling from Shiraz, and a far more powerful sovereign over a much bigger terrain. He was quickly arrested, Mir Mahana, for being a thorn in the side of the main Persian court, and eventually he was executed in Basra in 1769 by Karim Khan Zand. Today, Mir Mahana has been the subject of a play in the poster at the top, and also there's a computer game about him, and that's the logo of that at the bottom. So there were many pearls beforehand and many pearls afterwards. I'll say a little bit more about Buschman's wife. She was born Anna Maria Pak, and her family came from Bombay. She was not from a recognized family of wealthy nabobs, and we know from Stein and Otto Blaker's work that her father was Sir George Pak. He was born in London. He was a writer and quartermaster. So he was a middle grade mercantile member of staff of the HEIC, but not likely at all to have taken an English wife with him. And the manuals at the time advised the East India Company to marry natives to help keep them cool. They married in Bombay, they lived in Kharg, and she was noted to be the only European woman in the Gulf. And as I said, the visitors described pleasant times in their garden. So after Buschman died, she married Ferdinand de Jong in 1767 in Batavia, where they went after fleeing Kharg, and they had a son. Anna herself died of smallpox in 1773. It's obvious because Dijon wrote that he bitterly regretted she'd never been vaccinated after she passed away. There's no portrait of Anna, but we do think we may have come across the portrait of the namesake maid. So Anna was likely the daughter of an Indian mother and a British military father. And there's one image of about 1820 in the V&A. So she was born here in Bombay. Let's have another little look at these two portraits. The girl looks Javanese, and I don't think there's much reason to doubt that at all. The girl with the orange blossom was sold by one of the major auction houses and acquired by the Art Gallery of Ontario. And she's covered in pearls. She's in a garden with a Masonic fountain, and she is wearing very beautiful silk dress. The only silk had that satin at the time, and fine Dhaka Indian muslin at the top of the dress and on the sleeves, as well as the lace. So she is in a quite high status get-up. A companion portrait, both signed by Jeremiah Schultz, appears to show exactly the same person, perhaps a little more mature. I've no doubt whatsoever from the ratio of the hips to the shoulders that that's also a woman in the right-hand portrait in the green suit. And when you look at the nose, the mouth, the ear cartilage, the sinus brows, the shape of the eyebrows, the hairline, I'm almost certain it's the same person. And that was pointed out too by my research colleagues. And if you have a close look, I think you're just looking at a more mature version of the same person on the left. And the only documentation it covers not just immigration and freedom, but adoption and baptism, and it's Dijon's maid, Anna Maria Kanangan, and Kanangan is Javanese surname, and there's her baptismal certificate from 1772. The watercolor is the maid of an amateur artist from Java. She may well be wearing quite masculine clothes. This is Frederick the Great's sister, in a stylized military type of suit done as a dress, but unusually it looks much more masculine that the apparent Anna is wearing the green suit. So it raises as many questions as it answers. Anna Dijon, Anna Buschman was a pivotal actor in the story. She was a woman of the world, born in Bombay, lived in Kharg, lived in Batavia, also lived in Amsterdam and Leiden, consort to Buschman, consort to Dijon, an attachment figure, very deeply attached, hostess, heiress, home manager, mother. She was not in the background. She was prominent, she was effective, she was respected, but she was certainly in a society with a different structure across continents. Now, I was fortunate to come across this document in the archives. It had been incorrectly catalogued, but it is from Aleppo in 1766. And Nicholas van Marek, who was the VOC consul in Aleppo, recorded a report that when Buschman left Kharg, he had seine Reichtum, that's written at the bottom, of 3 lakh, which is 300,000 rupees, 30,000 pounds sterling. That is a modern equivalent of upwards of 4.2 million. That is such an enormous amount of money that he could not possibly have raked off the sales that were being declared. And given that there's no mention of pearls whatsoever, given that there's very strong evidence Kniphausen was psychopathic and set up a pearl fraud, it's almost certain that Buschman took all the pearls and it ended up being about 10 times his predicted wages. That's Aleppo at the bottom. If you look at the pay per month of an upper merchant was 40 florins, and under merchant 20 florins, and there's no way that would come to 10% of the actual wealth that was reported that Buschman took. So it was thanks to Dutch law that Anna could inherit it, and thanks to that law that it stayed in the system and De Jong got it, and eventually it went to his artistic patronage. The inheritance ethics of the Dutch Republic and the Dutch East India Company were progressive. And it's actually very interesting to read the quality of the human rights law described by Buschman himself in this document. The VOC had legal benefits for widows. They could inherit property, maintain control of their finances and their husband's wills. In the Cape Colony, widows were able to set up households independently of their children with sizable inheritances relative to other heirs. There was an egalitarian distribution of property, a strong commitment to the nuclear family embedded in law, and that was strengthened by the wills. The Dutch widows benefited more than British women, and the VOC also had a very good welfare state for orphans. And coming back to Carl Theodore, this is his wife, and her pearls in the portrait of 1760 survived. So it's by Tischbein, and those pearls were recently exhibited in Mannheim. And they may very well have gone through Kharg, because the Germans would have sourced pearls through the Dutch. They may very well be Kharg pearls. If they're not, then they would have probably come from the east coast of India. So Kharg was a dry island. Kharg did not have much endemic malaria. There were very few deaths on Kharg, and we wrote in some more detail in the paper about Buschman's observations of the death rate being remarkably low, and it must have been because it was a good anti-malarial landscape. So that was conducive to lasting survival and conducive to lasting embezzlement. And that's Kharg in the 1850s from the Illustrated London News. There we have it, a relatively dry island, which is good for preventing malaria and controlled irrigation, not stagnant puddles. He's a restored historic aqueduct from Kharg. But it wasn't all plain sailing. De Jong was extremely fortunate to survive 10 years. When Buschman landed, he was dead in 3 months, and there's a very tremulous signature on his will document. He even countersigned the will in the archives which survived, which is extraordinary. So in this earlier picture, there they are fishing in a free-flowing canal, good anti-malarial water. The fish eat the larvae. The larvae don't hang around in flowing water, but it's silted up. After Buschman died, only 3 years later, Captain Cook and Joseph Banks were there, and his crew began taking ill. Cook thought it was the hot weather. William Monkhouse, who'd been the chemist in Carlisle and became a ship's surgeon, died of a fever. And by the time Cook left, having repaired Endeavour, hauled on the Barrier Reef, 7 were dead from this fever. It was malaria, it wasn't yellow fever. And Iris Brine, in her book on the ship's surgeons of the VOC, explained how the canals had silted up and therefore perfect malarial landscape. Cook himself said it was the unwholesome air. And the Dutch captains were surprised that he hadn't had half of his crew die in the 6 weeks they were there. Joseph Banks and his teams had a bit more cash up their sleeves. They all stayed in a hotel. So as I say, that was 3 years after Buschman had died of malaria, just shortly before De Jong left. That's Banks by Reynolds on the right and Banks by Stubbs on the left. And in that left-hand portrait, he's inheriting his estate, which was why he could employ artists, assistant scientists, and stay in hotels. To summarize the money trail to Mozart, we went through 300 pages of VOC accounts. Buschman was on Kharg from 1757 to 65. It had only been founded 4 years before his arrival. He seems to have taken all the pearl trade worth over 4 million. Now, I would say that his bot, Kniphausen, was a psychopath because he was such a consummate repeated liar. Buschman drank and could upset his colleagues, according to one description. For him, it was more subcultural, I think. So they left After Kharg fell, they reached Batavia many months later in 1766, in October. 3 months later, Buschman's dead. And Anna Buschman, from the records, inherited 29,000 florins, a huge amount. She died in 1773. And in 1777, de Jong sponsored Mozart. 1782 and afterwards, he appears to have sponsored Baitz, Schultz, maybe other artists, but no portrait survives of Anna. The irony is that the private wealth was weakening the Dutch East India Company. It weakened the management of Batavia's canals and sanitation, and it actually killed Buschman. How much was that 29,000 florins? Well, there are calculation instruments, measuringworth.com and pierremarteau.com, and they draw on historic sources by Newton and Parisius. In terms of wages, 4 or 5 million. In terms of investment potential, as much as 40 million. 100 Dutch guilders was about £9 in historic exchange. So Buschman was extremely rich, and by default and Dutch inheritance, so was de Jong. Pearls were an ideal cryptocurrency for 18th century private wealth, just like the €500 note. If you want to conceal a large amount of money or store it, or you want to sell it or shift it about, it was perfect. It did a lot of damage to the Dutch East India Company. You have to assume that market forces were going somewhere to fair pricing between Buschman and the local natives. They were at least subsisting. But it did an awful lot of damage to the company's economy. However, on occasions it was put to lasting good use, like very nice paintings and works by Mozart. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, good.
I can hear the answer, yes.
Well, thank you very much for a very, very comprehensive and extensive investigation into Buschman and his dealings and how this resulted in the sort of patronage, if you like, for Mozart. And I was just wondering if you will take some questions from the audience.
I'd be very happy to. Thank you.
Do you have any? I have one then, just to start everyone off, but Anna and Buschman had a child, did they? Or have I remembering that wrongly?
They did, and so did Anna and de Jong.
Yes.
Now, Buschman's son did not live long. Otto Blaker found the death certificate. De Jong's son lived into adulthood, and he became a soldier in Austria, but died 2 or 3 years after his father. So de Jong died in the 1790s, age 63. So Anna had a son and actually gave birth in the ship's cabin when they were going from Batavia to Amsterdam. They went back to Texel Island and then back to Amsterdam. And she must have given birth in the cabin, probably with her husband assisting, because he did everything. He was the town surgeon, who was also the pathologist. And before becoming the senior surgeon, he did duties on the ships. And we know he went to Chunchara, which is the Dutch base north of Kolkata, and he went to the Gulf. He traveled quite extensively. He didn't go to Siam. One factor that's quite interesting that would have driven pregnant Anna out of Batavia was the war going on between Siam and Burma. So she would have had a son in Batavia under normal circumstances. But it appears their fleeing was quite precipitous, because the Burmese fleet were harrying the Dutch off Java, and also they were under threat of starvation because Batavia was not self-sufficient in rice, and it was importing from a UTR from Siam. And when that was blockaded and a UTR fell to the Burmese, they were under real threat that they were going to have nothing to eat. There's no primary record of it, but it appears that you wouldn't normally opt to have a baby in a ship's cabin on a 6-month journey rife with febrile diseases. And I think that may have pushed them into leaving sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you. Peter. I'm going to have to repeat your question into the mic for people online.
How did he sell those vast fortune pearls, fictitious?
That's a good question. I'm just repeating this for people online. How did he Buschman dispose of this vast fortune, which he'd sort of acquired surreptitiously? And how did he sell the pearls? How did he get money for them, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Aleppo document does not describe pearls, it describes his wealth. So the implication is it was cash by then. So if he's piling up cash, you can only assume that he's selling pearls to the visiting captains. So the British captains, and I think there are also some French captains, they may have been buying them. They were extremely expensive. The top strings of pearls would be worth the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands. There was one calculation we did, I put it in the paper, and I was looking at the price of a particular necklace in the Cape in the 18th century compared to the prices of horses. And it appeared to be something like £300,000 or £400,000 for a string of the best pearls. And some of these were real giants and real beauties, regarded as jewels. A lot of money in it, but beautiful to hide, small, easy to transport, easy to stash, really just like Bitcoin or €500 notes. Policing nightmare and a criminal's dream. And I think that he must have sold them all and not had the chance. He'd not have sold those pearls in Batavia. If he'd taken them to Batavia, he would have known, because he mentioned Franz Cantor being in trouble so many times. He would have known he'd be in immense trouble himself if he was caught. And it's a bit like the principle of, don't steal an item from the box because people will notice. You steal the whole box.
Right. You have another question? Do you have a question? The question is, did Mozart mention him, and is there any documentary evidence or references? Is that question? Yeah.
That's a very good question. Mozart did, and he described de Jong as unter Indianer, without any racial selection. He said he was our man of the Indies, and he wrote about 4 letters to his father mentioning de Jong and the contract. Mozart was struggling, and he was scared he wasn't going to be able to honour the contract, and he wanted to make a very good job of it. I think in the end he did honour that contract. And if you go through Mozart's letters edited by Emily Anderson, or you can read the originals online, he mentions de Jong again and again. He mentions Wendling again and again. And I wanted to form my own opinion about exactly what Mozart wrote. And I went through the primary sources and thought about where de Jong was. And I published another paper after the 2023 in JRAS about the Mozart flute concertos, how playable they were, and what the exact patronage was. I think that de Jong probably paid for 3, if not all 4, and we were able to revise the watermark evidence on that, because some of the dating was wrong, and Mozart was buying paper with forged watermarks. So there's a lot of shenanigans went on in the 18th century. But he certainly did. He mentions our man of the Indies, and he also describes him as De Kara Hollander, the brave Dutchman. And it kind of threw us off the scent. in the 1970s, James Galway talked about a Dutchman called De Jong sponsoring the flute concertos. That wasn't quite right, because De Jong was born in Bonn. He grew up in the Bonn court with Beethoven's father, and the grandfather of Beethoven was the Kapellmeister. So he may well have had lessons with the flautist under Beethoven's grandfather to learn the flute. And I think there's no doubt either that later on there's a famous painting of Mozart and the Masons in Vienna. The book about the painting was written by H.C. Robbins Landon. And on the right at the front, there's Mozart. There's Nicholas Esterhazy shortly before his death, presiding over the Masonic ceremony. And on the left, I think without any doubt, in the same wig as in his portrait by Bice, there's De Jong. He's the only person in the portrait, when you magnify it, with a 1740 style wig. Everybody else is bang up to date. And he's also wearing a bright green suit. And in De Jong's will, there is a bright green suit mentioned. So it looks like De Jong is in the painting of the Masons with Mozart. He also fits a drawing. There was a drawing auctioned, possibly felt to be Mozart at the keyboard. And when we were able, I spent about 6 months going around German galleries, and we were able to identify quite a lot of people in it. And it wasn't Mozart at the keyboard, it's young Prince Max, who eventually inherited from Carl Theodor. And he was a harpsichordist and a really nice chap. And De Jong is in it with Wendling playing the flute, playing the Baroque flute in an orchestra. So you can read those. Now, the key phrases are Der wackere Holländer, the strapping Dutchman, and Unser Indianer.
Lionel.
Wonderfully interesting. Can I, a bit greedy, but attempt two questions. There was a reference to Catholic Masons in Holland. I mean, I was thinking of, there was a bull, wasn't there, condemning prohibition on masonry. About that. The other thing was Armenians were mentioned several times. I wonder if they come from New Jolfa. Were they attached to local rulers? Was there a network? I know in the next century, over on the other side in Madras, they were flourishing so much they were financing Armenian publishing in Venice, weren't they?
Right. Well, I'll just summarise some of this. So the first question was really the reference to Roman Catholic Masonry. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. I think that was in reference to the person who helped Stephen, who was doing his PhD on it. Is that right? And the second question is, who were the Armenians in Kharg? Were they from New Jolfa, or what was, what do we know about the Armenians there?
Okay. Well, in respect of the Catholic Masons, there were specific Catholic lodges. There was no lodge on Kharg, but there was a Batavian lodge, and there were multiple lodges in Amsterdam and in Leiden. And it appears somehow De Jong had got to know Wendling during his time in Leiden. In respect of where the Armenians came from, they were apparently living in a kind of separate village outside of the ramparts, because Buschman described them being in the houses before they breached the ramparts, before they surrendered and let them have it. There was a Jewish merchant there as well at that time, I think dealing in Jews, and it was an interesting ethnic mix. There was a lot of interplay with Armenian settlements in the other Persian trading centers. So they get a mention in Bandar Rig, Bandar Bushehr, in Basra, in Shiraz, and that's about as far as I can answer it. I think it's a very good question, and there's a lot more that could be analysed just from going through those basic 300 pages. We drew on an archive of 3,000 pages in order to select that out. And some of the finds from the wider archives were just pure luck. So I may have answered your question in part. I don't know if there's anything else I could have a stab at.
Thank you. I think you've answered it very well. All right. Any other questions?
Why did you find
Why did
he finance?
Why did he finance Mozart?
Yeah.
Yes. The question is, why do you think he acted as a patron or financed Mozart's compositions? Oh, yes.
Was able to access it through the Masons, and De Jong was a polymath.
Oh, we've lost the sound.
Can you hear me?
No, it's a little bit low. I'm just going to see. Hold on. That should be.
Mine's at maximum.
How about now?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yeah. Good. Good. De Jong was a polymath. He published papers on chemistry, and he revised a prominent medical text. He corresponded with other scientists. He went to meet William Hunter, the anatomist and obstetrician, and he liked to have this multi-interest kind of encyclopedic Diderot approach of the Enlightenment. I think he was a true man of the Enlightenment. And it's not something you acquire overnight playing the Baroque flute. You have to work at it for years, and the likely opportunity was when he was a boy in the Bond court as a teenager. I think he probably learned it with the flautist of the Bond court, where his father was the sommelier. His father was the Archbishop Elector's wine and food manager, who's also his wine taster. So De Jong was a musician as well as a scientist. He joined the army after getting into trouble with possibly gambling debts, and he was bankrupt. He had letters going to his father about conflict over his handling of his money, and he joined the VOC. Quite a lot of Germans did. The bishop paid for De Jong to study medicine in Strasbourg, and didn't give him a job afterwards, which was something of a letdown. He was pursuing Mozart at a point where his wife had died. He'd done his anatomy studies. He'd become a physician as well as a surgeon. So he'd studied more in Leiden. He was in Leiden because it was the prime Northern European, mainland Europe medical centre. And I think he liked to be busy. He must have been very busy as a doctor in Batavia. We know that he did hundreds of postmortems. And it seems to me that music fills a gap. If you read about any European colonies in Asia, the social gap is huge, and things like dancing and music become very important. So I think he's wanted to keep that going, and he's obviously enjoyed his flute music. His library is illuminated by a catalogue, because when he moved to Vienna, he sold a lot of his books, and a huge part of his library was catalogued. And we know he had quite a lot of diverse sheet music. He sold part of a harpsichord, and he had a lot of books on religious philosophy. He was a real man of the Enlightenment. So if you add all that up together, wanting to meet the world's best flautist in the best orchestra, it was like the Berlin Philharmonic. Carl Theodor was getting the best musicians. He's probably paying them more than anybody else. So De Jong gravitates through the Masons to Wendling, to Mozart, and he wants to create this. His father, interestingly, had done some artistic sponsorship. His father, Anton de Jong, who was initialed in as an emblem in the portrait on the spine of the. His father had bought a beautiful religious statue for the Bad Godesberg church near Bonn. It's still there. So there was this superego of patronage as well. But I think it was about quality, and I think it was about wanting to pursue beauty and polymathic interest.
Right, thank you. Matty, are there any questions on the chat?
We don't. If anyone wants to
Right.
ask one quickly now, please do so.
Okay. I think we're okay. No questions?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, well, I think we'll finish there. And I'd just like to thank Stephen very, very much indeed for this lecture. I forgot to mention in the introduction that he is actually a very consummate flautist himself and has given lectures here and played the flute and in a wonderful way. So thank you very much. Can you hear us, Stephen?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
good.
Very, very good.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
And we look forward to hearing more. So thanks very much indeed.
That means more work.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you very
you
much.
can now go to bed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I shall be snoring in 5 minutes.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye. Good night.
Good night.